And welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. On this podcast, we're going to start talking about the kind of an introduction to the distinction between a classical and Keynesian economist. And we're going to paint with some pretty broad brushes here. And we'll get into more details and kind of hash out some of the more subtleties in later videos. But just kind of in a very general sense, I want to introduce the two sides in the great debate in macroeconomics. So we start first of all with Adam Smith in 1776, and from 1776 to the 1930s, when he writes his book The Wealth of Nations in 1776, up through the 1930s and the Great Depression. We're going to call this I'm going to call this the classical era. This is the classical era of classical economists. Now, there's a lot there when I say classical economists. There's a lot to talk about, but I'm going to paint with very broad brushes, and I will give you a little bit more detail here coming up. But just right now, paint with very broad brushes. Classical economists would generally say that markets work, leave them alone, not too much government interference. You don't really need governments to manage economies. They kind of self-regulate. I'll say more of that again in detail in a little bit. Number two, the second era is from the Great Depression in the 1930s, when suddenly it seems like the classical position on the world is no longer correct. That is to say, economies do not self-regulate. They do not self-correct. So the Great Depression drags on and on and on and on. And so John Maynard Keynes comes along and he says, okay, some of this classical economic model isn't working. So in 1936, he writes his book called The General Theory, and in it, he's going to argue that economies can get stuck in equilibriums that are recessionary, and they can't get out of these recessions or depressions without some form of government intervention. So in a very broad way, these Keynesians, or this Keynesian era from 1930s into 1970s, is going to be an era where the government they will argue, play a bigger role in managing the macroeconomy. The third era is going to be, I'm going to say, is from the 1970s up through 2008. And I'm going to say that this is the reemergence of the classical position. And two of the prominent economists at the time who both win Nobel Prizes are Milton Friedman and Friedrich August von Hayek. Both of them are going to win Nobel Prizes and are going to be part of the reemerging of the classical view of the world. Now, please understand, when I say this, like I'm not saying that, for example, from 1930s to 1970s, I'm not saying that every economist was a Keynesian, but that's kind of the dominant thought of the period. I mean, Friedman and Hayek were still around during this time period. Hayek was around for a while. Friedman was coming onto the scene, but they were not the prominent voices of the time. But they will become much more prominent in the 1970s, and their ideas will be more prominent up through, I'm going to say, 2008. One might disagree with me on that. And then I'm going to say 2008 is a little bit like the Great Depression. You get this financial collapse, and it seems to indicate, we could debate details on this, I'm not going to right now, but it seems to indicate that it's not enough just to leave things to markets, that you need government involved in some kind of way, and that leads to some shift back to the Keynesians since 2008. So I would say from 2008 up until the present, I'm making this video in 2016. So from 2008 up to what I'm calling the present, it's kind of a shift back towards the Keynesian position. So these are kind of the four major eras of the great debate between the role of government and the great debate between the classical and Keynesian economists. In some future videos, I'll talk more in detail about the classical economists and the Keynesian economist. This has been Mr. Hagan. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you on the next podcast.